At 6:37 a.m. on November 30th, 1939, a freezing wind swept across the Karelian Isthmus, carrying the sound of distant artillery fire toward a small, isolated farm near the village of Rautjärvi. Simo Häyhä stood in his doorway, pulling on a thick wool sweater, watching the sky where the sun should have been rising. He was 33 years old, 5 feet 3 inches tall, a man known locally for his quiet demeanor, his prize-winning moose hunting dogs, and his unparalleled skill with a rifle. But today, the sound in the distance was not the crack of a hunting rifle. It was the crushing weight of an entire modern army. The Soviet Union had just launched a full-scale invasion of Finland. 3 million Soviet soldiers, 6,000 tanks, 4,000 aircraft, all descending on a nation of just 3.7 million people who possessed 32 tanks and 114 combat aircraft. The odds were beyond impossible. They were absurd. The invasion was a mathematical certainty of Finnish annihilation, a quick, brutal campaign that Moscow expected to conclude within a matter of days. And Simo Häyhä, the farmer who had just been called up for military reserve duty, was their only hope. He did not possess a new, complex automatic rifle. He did not have a precision scope. He had been issued a bolt-action Seiko M-28-30 rifle, a Finnish variant of the aging Mosin Nagant. It was a weapon designed decades earlier, and his peers, the other men of the Finnish 34th Infantry Regiment, noted with some amusement that he had refused the standard telescopic sight, preferring the simple metal notch and post, the iron sights. They called him traditional. They called him old-fashioned. The Soviet Red Army would soon call him something else entirely. They would call him Beloya Smert, the White Death. The Finnish defensive line was a joke. It was less a line and more a series of small, isolated strongpoints, relying on the overwhelming advantage of the landscape: endless forests, frozen lakes, and a deep, crushing, relentless cold. It was here, in the sub-zero landscape of the Kola River sector, a remote corner of the isthmus, that the impossible would begin. The Soviets were trying to punch a hole straight through the center of the Finnish defenses, aiming to split the country in two and force a quick surrender. They drove their massive mechanized columns onto frozen logging roads, trusting in their sheer numbers to overwhelm the sparsely defended Finnish positions. What they did not count on was the cold. What they did not count on was the snow. And what they certainly did not count on was the relentless, surgical brilliance of a single man who understood the language of the forest better than any soldier on either side. The cold was not a factor. The cold was a weapon. Temperatures plummeted to 40 degrees below zero Celsius and Fahrenheit, a point where human flesh could freeze in minutes if exposed. Oil in the Soviet tanks turned to sludge, guns jammed, and the centralized command structure of the Red Army, designed for mass maneuvering, began to disintegrate under the sheer weight of the environment. The Soviet soldiers, many of them conscripts poorly equipped for the Arctic, struggled to stay warm, burning wood in open pits that sent plumes of smoke straight into the crisp, clear air. And Simo Häyhä watched those plumes. He watched them from the deep cover of the endless, silent pine trees, shrouded entirely in white snow camouflage, moving with the quiet grace of a ghost. The Finns called this their sisu. It is a word that does not translate easily into English. It means determination, resilience, a stubborn, almost suicidal courage in the face of impossible odds. It is the quality that makes a nation of 3.7 million people refuse to surrender to a totalitarian giant. And it was the quality that Häyhä embodied. He did not operate in large groups. He did not rely on complex supply lines or coordinated artillery support. His theater of operations was small, perhaps only a few square kilometers of forest near the Kola River, where the Soviets were pouring their endless reserves. He would ski out before dawn, long before the winter light could truly penetrate the deep canopy of the forest. He carried his rifle, perhaps a small bag of food and enough ammunition to last the day. He worked alone. He selected his position with the eye of a master hunter, a place where he could see the Soviet line of advance, but where he himself was invisible. The most critical element of his technique was the snow. Häyhä would pack the snow down in a tight mound in front of his firing position. This achieved three critical things, three things that confounded the enemy. First, it hid the crucial immediate flash of his muzzle when he fired, concealing his exact position. Second, it created a small, stable firing rest for his rifle, ensuring maximum accuracy in a frozen, uneven world. And third, most ingeniously, he used that packed snow to absorb the plume of white vapor that escaped his lungs when he exhaled in the crushing cold. Any other man, firing in that temperature, would see a visible, telltale cloud of white breath curling upward, marking his location for enemy eyes. Häyhä simply took the snow into his mouth, melting it instantly before he breathed out, or otherwise positioning himself so low to the ground and so well concealed that the telltale steam dispersed harmlessly into the packed snow. The Soviets were dying, but they could never, for the life of them, figure out where the shots were coming from. He was using a 19th century weapon to defeat a 20th century army, and his reasons for refusing the scope were rooted in this deep understanding of his environment. The telescopic sight, prized by every other major army, required the user to raise his head higher off the ground, increasing his profile by several crucial inches. In the flat, white landscape, that increased profile meant certain death from an enemy countersniper. Secondly, a telescopic sight could easily fog up in the extreme, fluctuating temperatures, rendering the expensive, complex piece of technology useless. But most critically, the glass of a scope could, and often did, produce a flicker of light, a tiny, almost imperceptible reflection from the sun, the moon, or even the weak ambient light filtering through the snow. That flicker was a death sentence. Häyhä chose the simplicity of iron sights. He had trained on them since boyhood, trusting his own eyes and his own skill. He was the perfect example of human capability triumphing over technological advancement. His entire philosophy was built on minimizing profile, maximizing stealth, and trusting an intuition built from decades of hunting in that exact environment. By the second week of December, the Finnish troops in the Kola sector were holding their ground against seemingly insurmountable odds, but the pressure was unbearable. The Soviet forces, frustrated by their inability to advance, resorted to massive, indiscriminate shelling. They would shell the forests for hours, then send in waves of infantry expecting to find the Finns shattered and broken. Instead, they found silence, a profound, lethal silence. Then, a single shot. Then, another. Always from a different direction, always targeting an officer, a medic, or a machine gunner. The morale drain was immediate and devastating. The Russian soldiers, already demoralized by the cold and the mismanagement of their commanders, began to believe they were fighting not an army, but a ghost, a phantom in the snow. The numbers began to climb at an astonishing rate. Häyhä was not merely killing 1 or 2 men a day, he was operating on a scale that transcended traditional military sniping. The Soviets started pushing patrols of 10 to 15 men into the forest, hoping to simply stumble upon the invisible threat. These patrols disappeared. Häyhä's unit started finding his empty cartridge casings scattered around his positions, small piles that indicated dozens of shots fired, dozens of men fallen. The official count, painstakingly recorded by the Finnish army, began to show tallies that defied belief. 10, 15, sometimes 25 confirmed kills in a single 10-hour day of weak sunlight. It was a daily, surgical massacre carried out by one man who required no one else. To understand the sheer magnitude of this achievement, you must understand the environment. This was not the rolling hills of France or the open deserts of North Africa. This was the taiga, dense coniferous forests buried under meters of snow, laced with frozen bogs and constantly under the shadow of the enemy. Movement was exhausting. Every step was a calculation of weight, sound, and concealment. Yet Häyhä was able to stalk, set up, fire, relocate, and repeat this cycle for weeks on end, living off minimal rations and sleeping in the open when necessary. The Soviets quickly realized they were facing not just a sniper, but a strategic weapon. The Finnish frontline commanders started leveraging Häyhä's presence. They didn't need to know his location, they simply needed to know he was there. The sheer psychological terror he induced was enough to slow down entire Soviet advances. Officers refused to give commands out loud. Communications were reduced to hurried whispers. Soldiers refused to follow orders that sent them into the tree line. The Red Army was being psychologically defeated before a single engagement began, all because of the presence of the ghost in the snow. And this brings us to the crucial pivot, the exact point where a man's name becomes a legend, where history is written not in grand strategy, but in individual action. It's the paradox of the Winter War, the most technologically advanced army of its time, relying on tanks and planes, being absolutely crippled by a single farmer with a rifle that cost less than the boots of the Soviet field marshal. How do you fight something you cannot see? How do you defeat a phantom who kills silently, at will, and then disappears without leaving a single trace? The Soviets, learning of the devastating kill rate, began their countermeasures. This wasn't just about tactical survival, this was about political humiliation. The vast, powerful Soviet Union, unable to defeat a tiny, impoverished nation, and now finding its frontline troops paralyzed by a single man? The Red Army assigned specialist teams, their own professional snipers, the Jägeri, trained in the Soviet system of precision killing, to hunt the White Death. These were highly trained, experienced veterans given orders to find the Finn, neutralize the threat, and restore order. The resulting conflict was not a battle of armies, but a deadly, protracted duel of invisibility. Häyhä was now being hunted by men who understood his craft, but he understood theirs better. The Soviet snipers were immediately at a disadvantage because they relied on telescopic sights. And Häyhä, with his practiced eye and his decades of hunting knowledge, knew exactly how to spot the telltale glint of light from a scope lens, or the marginally higher profile required to sight through it. The hunters became the hunted. Häyhä started picking off the Soviet snipers one by one, turning their own tactics against them. He'd wait for the flicker or the slightest movement, and then, with his simple iron sights, he would put a round through the enemy's head before the Soviet soldier even realized he had been spotted. The average engagement range was between 150 and 450 yards, sometimes farther, but always a distance where a single missed shot meant Häyhä's own death. He was not just fighting the Soviets, he was fighting the clock. The entire war lasted only 105 days. Häyhä fought for approximately 100 days, meaning his average confirmed kill rate during this period exceeded 5 men per day. This tally includes only those confirmed kills witnessed and documented by the Finnish side, not the vast unconfirmed numbers he accumulated in the chaos. And this number only includes his rifle kills. Häyhä also carried a Suomi KP-31 submachine gun for close quarters fighting, particularly when Soviet patrols got too close or when his position was discovered. With the submachine gun, he accumulated an estimated 200 additional kills, bringing his probable total well over 700 men. He would kill 10 to 15 men with the rifle, then grab his submachine gun and wipe out the rest of the patrol in a blinding spray of rounds, disappearing back into the forest before the dust settled. It was a terrifying, almost inhuman performance. The Soviets, driven to absolute distraction, started employing a tactic they called the hammer. Unable to locate the sniper, they would simply select an area where the White Death was known to operate, and then they would saturate that area with artillery fire. Massive, prolonged barrages, sometimes lasting hours, turning the pristine white forest into a churned-up mess of mud, shattered timber, and shell craters. They called it the Bolo's Banquet, trying to invite the Finnish bolo, their derogatory term for a Finn, to lunch with high explosives. They thought nothing could survive this. They were wrong. Häyhä survived these constant barrages by anticipating the cycle, waiting for the first shelling, moving slightly, and then returning to his territory as soon as the smoke cleared, knowing that the enemy infantry would immediately move in to survey the damage. And when they did, he was there, silent, waiting, and deadly. He adapted instantly, while the Soviet bureaucracy could only respond with brute force. The psychological warfare was now total. Soviet soldiers were issued orders to kill the Finnish sniper, offering significant rewards for his elimination. They sent entire squads of dedicated counter-snipers and special demolition teams to neutralize him. They brought heavy machine guns and deployed them specifically to sweep the forest canopy where he was rumored to hide. They tried everything. And every time, the result was the same. The team sent to hunt him disappeared one by one, swallowed by the cold silence.
their mission reports ending abruptly in the middle of a sentence, their commanders only knowing that their best men had failed to return, killed by a man they had never seen, using a rifle they had already dismissed as obsolete. This constant daily tension took a toll on the man himself. Häyhä was not just a machine, he was a deeply private, simple man forced into a brutal, high-stakes game of survival. Every morning he had to face the certainty that today would be the day he was finally caught. Every afternoon he had to reload his 5-round magazine, knowing that the next bullet could be his last. He was operating in a perpetual state of hyper-awareness, where the smallest mistake, a misplaced branch, a slightly louder boot step on the crust of the snow, a breath taken at the wrong moment, meant a swift and agonizing death. Yet he persevered, fueled by that Finnish sisu. He wasn't fighting for grand ideology, he was fighting for the life he knew, the farm, the dogs, the right to fish and hunt in his own country without foreign interference. He was the embodiment of the local against the global, the individual against the monolith. By March 1940, the war was approaching its desperate conclusion. Finland was running out of men, out of ammunition, out of time. They had stalled the Soviet invasion for over 3 months, a feat of arms that shocked the world, but the material odds were finally becoming too great to bear. The Finnish forces in the Kola sector, though still holding, were facing a fresh wave of Soviet reinforcements, units explicitly tasked with overwhelming the defenses and silencing the mythical White Death once and for all. On March 6th, the weather had turned particularly harsh. The light was flat and diffuse, the snow falling heavily, creating a thick, blinding curtain of white noise. Häyhä was in his usual territory, hunting a small Soviet patrol that had foolishly ventured too close to the Finnish forward positions. He had already killed several members of the patrol when the fatal encounter occurred. The official records are sparse, sometimes contradictory, but the essential facts are clear. A Soviet counter-sniper, or perhaps just a lucky Red Army infantryman, managed to finally spot Häyhä's position. It was not a clean miss. The enemy soldier fired a single shot from his rifle. The bullet, possibly an explosive round intended for heavy machine gun use, or a standard round that fragmented upon impact, struck Simo Häyhä squarely in the face. The impact was catastrophic. The round shattered his upper jaw, tearing through his left cheek and exiting near the base of his skull. The force of the impact was so great that it knocked him unconscious, burying him slightly in the snow. He fell, silent as a felled tree, his rifle sliding out of his frozen grasp. His face was a mask of blood and tissue. The White Death had finally fallen. When his comrades found him hours later, they initially thought he was dead. The wound was grotesque, his body already stiffening in the cold. But he was breathing. They loaded him onto a makeshift sledge, dragged him back through the silent, bloody forest, and evacuated him to a field hospital. Häyhä remained in a coma for the better part of a week, drifting in and out of consciousness. When he finally opened his eyes, clear and fully aware, it was March 13th, 1940. It was the exact day the Moscow Peace Treaty was signed, ending the Winter War and forcing Finland to concede 11% of its territory to the Soviet Union. The war was over. He had won his personal battle, but his nation had lost the diplomatic one. Simo Häyhä's service was over. He had survived, but his recovery was a monumental effort. He spent the next year in military hospitals, undergoing 26 separate surgical procedures to rebuild his face and jaw. Doctors had to reconstruct his jawline and piece together the shattered bones. He was left with a permanent scar, a stark physical reminder of the cost of the White Death. He never complained. He never sought fame. His fame was simply an unavoidable consequence of his actions. When the Continuation War began in 1941, pitting Finland once again against the Soviet Union, Häyhä was offered a position of command, a chance to train the next generation of Finnish snipers. But his injuries made it impossible for him to return to combat. Instead, he returned to his farm. He became a successful dog breeder and elk hunter, living a life of profound, almost monastic simplicity. When visitors came, decades later, seeking the story of the legendary sniper, they found a small, quiet man who was completely uninterested in discussing the hundreds of men he had killed. When pressed, he would simply offer the same understated answer: "I did what I was told as well as I could." He died in 2002 at the age of 96, having outlived the Soviet Union itself by more than a decade. His life spanned a century of technological change, from the first bolt-action rifles to the age of precision-guided missiles, yet his legend remains rooted in the simplicity of his craft. He never used a scope. He never needed to. His method was born of an intimate knowledge of his environment and a quiet, terrifying self-confidence. The final verified tally of 505 confirmed kills with his rifle makes him the deadliest sniper in military history. No man has ever surpassed it. No man has even come close. He proved that in the brutal, chaotic world of war, the human element, skill, discipline, and an unbreakable will can trump all the technological might and overwhelming numbers an empire can muster. He was the farmer who terrified an army, the ghost in the snow, the quiet legend of Finnish Sisu that will never be forgotten. The story of Simo Häyhä is the story of a man who looked at an impossible problem, the survival of his nation against a giant, and reduced it to a series of individual, solvable equations. He didn't think about divisions or strategies. He thought about windage, trajectory, and how to keep his breath from freezing in the air. He solved the problem one man at a time, until the combined weight of his daily surgical violence reached a strategic tipping point that the Red Army simply could not comprehend or endure. His choice of the iron sight over the scope, his use of packed snow to conceal his breath, his relentless movement on skis, each element was a miniature act of genius, a practical innovation born not of an engineering lab, but of a freezing forest. He took the oldest tool of warfare and made it the most devastating. This quiet, unassuming man, only 5 feet 3 inches tall, stood as the ultimate symbol of a small nation's defiance. He became the living proof that a defensive war, fought on one's home turf with an absolute refusal to yield, could halt the gears of the world's largest military machine. His story is taught today not just in Finnish military academies, but in special forces training centers around the world, a testament to the power of fieldcraft, simplicity, and unmatched dedication. He was the deadliest man in the world, and he preferred the quiet life of a farmer, caring for his dogs and tending his land. The silence that followed his death in 2002 was the same silence that fell over the Kola River after every shot he fired, a silence that demanded respect, a silence that spoke of men who had been removed from the earth by an unseen hand. He asked for nothing, gave everything, and went home to live out his days on the land he helped defend. That is the essence of the legend of Simo Häyhä, the White Death. If this story moved you the way it moved us, if the sheer impossible skill of a man like Simo Häyhä reminds you why we preserve the stories of history's quiet heroes, do me a favor, hit that like button. Every single like tells the platform to show this story to more people. Every single like helps us ensure that the legend of the farmer who saved his country doesn't fade into the silence of history. Thank you for watching, and thank you for making sure Simo Häyhä doesn't disappear into silence. This man, the farmer, the sniper, the quiet hero of the Kola, deserves to be remembered, and you're helping make that happen.